Okay, sisters and brothers, we've had today, I think, something that's great about philosophy at Macquarie is how pluralist it's been. And I'm going to try and be unusually pluralist for me and do a bit of phenomenology and a bit of where I'm more comfortable, which is natural philosophy. I'm going to be talking about this notion of Ipseity or pre-reflective self-consciousness. And a bit of this talk is going to be pretty boring because it's going to be sort of literature review stuff. But I think that I really have to get the position of the phenomenologists right in order to make sense of anything that I'm going to try and say later. So for that reason, I have slides, and I ask you to suffer through the large block quotes on the slides where I really am trying to make sure that I get the interpretation of this literature, which isn't my home field, right. Okay, so what's my interest in Ipseity or pre-reflective self-consciousness? Well, my broader project is to try and understand and explain consciousness by taking a case study approach. And that is to look at particular types of experience and then explain why they occur. To date, my main interest has been self-consciousness of various forms, and in that vein, pathologies of self-consciousness have been really important. So I've been looking a lot at schizophrenia. Now, the phenomenological literature, both the phenomenological philosophical literature and the phenomenological psychiatric literature, have used this notion of Ipseity or pre-reflective self-consciousness as a way to try and understand this syndrome of schizophrenia, but specifically the experience of that syndrome, what it is like to be schizophrenic or to have, as we might say in a more contemporary psychiatric way, what is it like to have particular symptoms of psychosis, which are common in schizophrenia but also occur in other places. So that's the sort of vague background to what I'm doing. All right. So I'm going to talk about this notion of Ipseity and pre-reflective self-consciousness, as I said, and I'm going to suggest that as we've tried to import that into the natural philosophy of mind and study of consciousness, along with the phenomenology in the psychiatric sense, the notion that we've imported has been importantly ambiguous. And I'm going to suggest that there are two different readings of this idea. The first is to say that it is a metaphysical fact about our experience, about experiences, that all experiences are had by a subject. So that's just a fact about experience, that all experience must be to someone and can't be to no one. That's one notion of Ipseity. The other notion is more a claim about the content of self-consciousness. And this is the claim that whenever we have experience, included in that experience is an experience of the self as subject. So rather than it simply being metaphysically the case that all experiences occur to someone, it is also phenomenologically the case that all experiences seem to occur to you, at least at some sort of implicit level. Now, I'm not going to say that the phenomenologists aren't aware of this distinction. In fact, Dan sent me over the weekend a paper where they draw this distinction in very similar terms. But I want to highlight this distinction and draw out, if I have time, very quickly, what people like Dan seem to be saying the relationship between these two ideas is. But I want to highlight the distinction because once we get to doing the psychiatry and the phenomenology of psychotic symptoms, it seems like only one of these notions is ever at stake in the literature and not the other. Or that at least very often only the phenomenological sense, the kind of explicit sort of self-consciousness, I am the subject of experience, seems to be what people are actually talking about and actually trying to measure, and they're sort of ignoring this first notion of Ipseity, the metaphysical fact that all experiences occur to a subject. And I think that you can't say that you're taking the phenomenological approach or studying Ipseity or pre-reflective self-consciousness unless you do both. Okay, so now we start with the quotes. This is a statement of Dan's in 2000, that's right, yep. Okay, so this is part of the discussion of Ipseity in this paper. Every conscious experience belongs to a subject, that is, either to me or somebody else. It cannot belong to nobody. And this, I take it, is a statement of the kind of metaphysical reading. But we also get, and this is from the same paper, whether a certain experience is experienced as mine or not does not, however, depend upon something apart from the experience, but exactly upon the givenness of that experience, and we'll come back to that white bit later on. If the experience is given originally in a first-person mode of presentation, it is experienced as my experience, otherwise not. So we see in the first part of the white and in the yellow, the claim that this is something which is experienced, that it is my experience. It is experienced as. Okay. So these are, the metaphysical sense and the self-conscious sense that we're talking about. All right. Now, in the second quote there as well, we also saw a claim, I think, about the relationship between these two different ideas. So that in order to get this experience of it seeming to be my experience, so this bit which we might call, and we do call in the natural philosophy literature, a self-conscious experience, to get that, all that we need is that the experience presents itself to us in this first-person mode of presentation. So this is, I read it as a kind of substantive entailment claim, something which ultimately should be argued for. I don't think that this is a definitional claim. I think it's a theoretical hypothesis that just the fact that any experience occurs to me entails that I experience it as my experience. Now, I used to think, years ago when I was first starting to think about this stuff, that there was an act of conflation going on here. I don't think there is. I think that, and especially now with the more recent papers where this distinction is explicitly drawn, I don't think that anything's being conflated, but I think that there is, an entailment hypothesis here. So it's why these views, these two readings both need to go together, I think, if we're going to be taking a phenomenological approach to Ipseity, pre-reflective self-consciousness, etc. Okay. Now, if we have a look at these guys, Parnas and Sass, these guys are doing phenomenology of schizophrenia, essentially. Yeah, they're taking insights from the Husserlian literature, Dan's work, from Sean Gallagher and so on as well, trying to use that to describe and understand the experience of their patients. And they use pretty similar sorts of definitions of Ipseity, pre-reflective self-consciousness and so on. So this is one quote, again, sorry for the large body of text. We may speak of pre-reflective self-awareness whenever we are directly, non-inferentially conscious of our own occurrent thoughts, perceptions, feelings, or pains. These appear in a first-person mode of givenness that is given to the subject that immediately reveals them as our own. So that's the entailment claim. And indeed, they say here entails as built-in self-reference. Thus, if the experience is given in the first-person mode of presentation to me, it is at least tacitly given as my experience and counts as a case of primitive or basic self-awareness. The subject of experience is a feature or function of its givenness. Ipseity is here considered as a medium in which specific modes of experience become articulated and thus equal the most basic form of selfhood. So this is coming from the psychiatric literature, and again I think we're seeing both claims here. In the yellow again we're seeing the claim about what is experienced, that the self or the subject is given at least tacitly, and that makes it a form of self-awareness in the yellow. But then we shift to this other claim about what it is to be the subject of experience and the medium that is the mode of givenness. So we're going back here to the metaphysical claim, which is supposed to entail the phenomenological fact. All right. But in another paper, when they give the definition, Sass and Parnas again, they seem to be more interested in just the experiential fact. So here we go. Ipseity refers to the experiential sense of being a vital and self-coinciding subject of experience or first-person perspective on the world. So the experiential sense of being a self or being a perspective. All right. Then this time though, this is the boring textual analysis part, and when they go back to the metaphysical claim, they do so, a couple of pages later. So they're shifting topic more explicitly then. All right. Now, Dorothée Legrand, someone trying to do similar things, I think, to what Dan does, obviously very heavily influenced by Dan. Also a similar sort of approach to what I'm taking in this talk, which is trying to merge the phenomenological and the naturalistic traditions. And we see the same confluence of claims, the metaphysical claim, the phenomenological claim, and the entailment relationship in her work. So this is what we get from Dorothée. It's any experience is pre-reflectively experienced as intrinsically subjective, so this is the experienced part, in the sense that it is experienced from the perspective of the experiencing subject. The latter is a first-person perspective, so that's the metaphysical claim about what a first-person perspective is tied to a self in the sense of being tied to a point of view of the experiencing, perceiving, acting subject. Okay. So if we want to try and make sense of, I think, these three claims, in particular the entailment claim, and this is something which I'm still struggling to understand, Dan, so I'm asking for your help, is that it's not obvious how you just get from a metaphysical fact to an experience of that fact, right? That's something that needs a substantive explanation. But it seems that this group of authors are trying to treat the experience of the self rather than the experience of ordinary, mundane objects as somehow special. Specifically, it seems that they're suggesting that there's more to the experience than representational content, and this seems to be required, I think, to get the entailment, because the block to the entailment seems to be you can't go from something is true to the subject is able to represent that fact. There needs to be a story told about how the subject gets to represent something. But you can go from something is true of experience to the subject experiences that fact if experiences that fact is understood in non-representational terms. So this is why I think Legrand is probably the most explicit on this. But this is why Kristina and I, in trying to understand this, are suggesting that maybe the line here is an anti-representationalist line, at least in the sense that they're saying there's more to what's in our experience than what we represent. Specifically here, this kind of built-in self-reference or Ipseity, pre-reflective self-consciousness. Now, that's going to be, I think, interesting when we get to looking at the phenomenology of psychotic symptoms later on, because what I'm going to be claiming there is that people, when they try and operationalise this sense, are always operationalising, or at least in a substantive number of cases, operationalising this sort of representational notion of self-consciousness, explicitly representational notion of self-consciousness. All right. All right, so we've already met Parnas and Sass. Now, these guys are interesting in a number of ways, but they're really quite interesting in the study of schizophrenia because they're one of a few, really a small and shrinking number of researchers who think that schizophrenia is a kind of unitary disorder, or at least substantially overlapping. And set of symptoms, within this, with the sort of mainstream psychiatric, mainstream's a bit mean to the phenomenologists there, but the sort of American style psychiatric approach, and one which is really popular here with Max's work and so on, is that to take the schizophrenia isn't to be understood as a single syndrome or a single disease, but rather as a kind of loose clustering of symptoms which happen to co-occur in a sufficiently interesting number of cases. Parnas and Sass, they take a different approach, and they think that schizophrenia is a single disease, or at least a much smaller number of diseases than the other tradition thinks of it. And they say that at the core of schizophrenia is a disturbance of Ipseity and a pre-reflective self-consciousness. And that deficit is going to explain the whole range of symptoms that we see. And that lots of different symptoms that we see are just different manifestations of Ipseity disturbance, given, I guess, individual circumstances. So, specifically, they've looked at, or people, them and people who were inspired by them have looked at, how you might get from disturbance of Ipseity to body hallucinations. How you might get from disturbance of Ipseity to apadonia, which is interesting because that's often sort of really shoved out of the study of delusions and hallucinations, where phenomenological work has been of the greatest interest in schizophrenia. And catatonia as well is interesting for the same reason. All right. So, we'll get to some specifics of one of their studies in a bit, but I mean, Parnas and Sass themselves, I think, are more consistent than the broader literature. So I just want to, say this to be fair to them before I get into the critical part of the talk, is that because they see this as this Ipseity disturbance is kind of generative of other symptoms, it's all right for them to go on and say study disorders of explicit self-consciousness, so the clearly representation part of self-consciousness as a disorder of Ipseity, because they think that it's generative of that. What I'm going to suggest in the more critical part is that there's another set of authors who are also saying disorder. We'll talk more about the specifics as we go, but I just wanted that disclaimer to say that, you know, I don't think that it's Parnas and Sass who are being unscholarly, but I still think that there is this confusion which exists in the broader literature. Okay. I think that we already talked about that without the slides. So there you go. Free bonus, you don't have to read those slides. All right. So, again, back to Sass and Parnas, you know, what did they say this disturbance of anxiety is specifically in schizophrenia? They say it's this. They say that actually it's two different things. First, there's this thing, hyper-reflectivity, which refers to a kind of exaggerated self-consciousness that is a tendency to direct focal objectifying attention towards processes and phenomena that would normally be inhabited or experienced as a part of oneself. So paying too much attention to things which you should just sort of live through. The second is this diminished self-affection, which refers to a decline in the passively or automatically experienced sense of existing as a living and unified subject of awareness. So that's the experiential sense of anxiety, which we seem to, on their point of view, lose, and in some publications, as a result of losing that, we then do this hyper-reflective thing of paying too much attention to other features of the self. All right, so much for Sass and Parnas, at least, you know, taking them as the canonical anxiety disturbance and what schizophrenia is, sort of people. We'll come back to one study where I think they are being less consistent later on. But first, I just wanted to run through a bunch of people who seem to be misusing, if you were going to, you know, say, people like Dan and so on have a, you know, proprietary reading of anxiety, it's their word. People who are doing natural philosophy or who are doing psychiatry, you seem to be misusing the notion. First lot of this is an empirical group, the experimental psychiatrists, I think. I'm not sure off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that. But it's Rohret and colleagues. And they start off their paper in 2009 really following Sass and Parnas and saying anxiety is this, and anxiety is a problem in schizophrenia. Well, maybe that's a substantive hypothesis. Let's go out and test it. Let's go and see if there is an anxiety disturbance. But when they go out and test it, what we see is that the methods that they use are all directed at sorts of explicit kinds of self-representation. So not the self which is implicit in all we experience, and certainly not the status of a self as subject of experience. They're certainly not testing things like whether or not there are experiences which have no subject, or looking at the difference between experienced and non-experienced. So these are the sorts of things they do. You know, is they give people a questionnaire and they ask them explicitly about how they perceive the size of their legs, how satisfied they are with their body, the relative size of their body compared to an ideal body. They ask about experiences that you know, and this is common in the study of schizophrenia, experiences that involve the blurring between the body and the rest of the world. So, I mean, what they seem to be doing is going out and studying self-consciousness as we generally think of it in the natural philosophy literature. How you represent yourself as a self, and how you explicitly think about yourself as a self. But they've done this from a starting point, trying to say that this is a disorder of anxiety, but that doesn't seem to be fitting with the intentions of the phenomenological literature. We see this in a few other studies. Like other group, Nelson and colleagues, they're wanting to look at, they do a review and they're trying to look at neural correlates of anxiety disturbances. But again, what we see is that what they're talking about is not anxiety in the senses that we introduced it before, but rather kinds of explicit self-representation. Specifically, they bring in the thing, which has been, we've made a massive deal of in consciousness studies and natural philosophy, which is self-monitoring problems. This is an interesting thing that seems to occur in conjunction with certain psychotic symptoms, is difficulties in knowing whether or not you, the patient, performed an action or whether or not someone else performed that action. And the studies that they really work closely with are voice attribution studies. So they do think, in these sorts of studies, a patient is lying in a brain scanner, it's a correlate study, and they are played a recording of themselves saying something, or someone else saying the same thing, or a recording of them saying it that has been distorted in some way. And their task is to say, is that a recording of you or is it a recording of someone else? Now, it is interesting that certain delusions seem to, people with delusions seem to also have difficulties with this task. But this, despite what Nelson and colleagues are saying, this doesn't seem to be an exciting problem. This is a problem of being able to tell what you're saying from one other, the nature of your voice from someone else's voice. And I don't think that this is the kind of problem that we could sort of fit into a nice, consistent picture by just saying that this is a hyper-reflectivity problem. Because it's not, their problem isn't that they're just paying too much attention to themselves, which would make this consistent with the Sass and Parnas type story. The problem is they're not representing themselves correctly, at least in their experience. I also, one place where this kind of problem turns up again, which I think is really interesting, is in some of Sean Gallagher's writing. And I think it's really interesting that it does turn up in Gallagher's writing, because in other places he's much more consistent with the phenomenological tradition as exemplified by Dan. But in his Trends in Cognitive Science paper, so again, as soon as we sort of try and do this, meeting of two worlds of phenomenology and natural philosophy, Gallagher, in this paper, he identifies what he calls two different forms of pre-reflective self-consciousness. That is the sense of agency, I am the source or initiator of the action, of an action or thought. Also a problem that he doesn't talk about, feeling in control, different problem. And the sense of ownership, which is the sense that I am experiencing or undergoing a thought or an action. Now, he's wanting to say that these are two kinds of pre-reflective self-consciousness, but these don't seem to have the kinds of features that Ipseity needs to be Ipseity, especially sense of agency, because pre-reflective self-consciousness, as it was sort of introduced at the start, was a feature of all experiences. I have, experience just occurs to someone and to me, and because of that, I experience it as mine. But that can't be the case with something like sense of agency, because I'm not the agent of all my experiences. Right? I might be the agent if I'm looking around of like a visual experience, if I'm looking around trying to find something, but you can be like a passive recipient of visual experience at least. So again, it seems like we're getting a shift in topic here. And so, I mean, whether or not this is a theoretical disaster for Gallagher or not is kind of up in the air. I don't think it is. What I'm trying to suggest, though, is that we're not getting this integration right. If we're trying to, say we're being pluralist and interdisciplinary and we're getting these things together, it doesn't seem that we actually are in this case. It seems that we're just changing the topic. last thing I wanted to talk about was just to be a bit worried about some of Parnas's work and whether or not it is wholly internally consistent. So these guys, they came up with something called the Examination of Anomalous Self-Experience Scale, which is a way of categorizing odd experiences of the self that occur in schizophrenia. On there, in the symptoms, common in schizophrenia on the other. All right. So when they introduce Ipseity, this is what they say. They give the metaphysical definition. The basic self-awareness, Ipseity, is a medium or mode in which specific intentional experiences such as perception, thinking, imagination articulate themselves. Okay, so that's the metaphysical claim. But when they turn to their scale and say, specifically looking at disorder of anxiety, they're looking at experiences of the self. So this is item 2.1 on this scale, diminished sense of basic self. So I think pretty clearly meant to tie to that definition that they gave. A pervasive sense of inner void, lack of inner nucleus, pervasive lack of identity, feeling of being anonymous, as if non-existent or profoundly different from other people. In this, you know, especially the later examples, come back to the just self-representation, explicit self-consciousness kind of view, which seems to be something extra to anxiety. You know, especially if we're talking about things like feeling like you're profoundly different from other people. I mean, that's explicit self-concept stuff, right? That's not just all experiences are had by a subject. That's what sort of thing you are in the world. Right, so they have further items that relate to disturbances in the sense of mindness for thoughts. That's my thought. Depersonalization. You know, so feelings that you're not a real person or that you're not really living through things. And hyperreflexivity, which I talked about before. But also things like the feeling of the self being divided, so of being a multiple entity, or of confusions about your identity or age. And again, once we get to these things, this seems to be about explicit self-concept and not about this sort of basic fact about experience, or even that you pay too much attention to yourself if you lose that. This seems to be a problem in the content, not that you're paying too much attention to yourself. All right, this is item 2.15. Now, let's start by reading. Diminished transparency of consciousness. A pervasive or recurrent sense of not being fully alert, fully awake, fully conscious, as if there were a lack of clarity, inner hindrance, or feeling of internal pressure blocking opacity. The acts of consciousness, or the very way of being conscious, appear as somehow peculiarly faded, diminished, or inefficient. Now, as you can see from how I've color-coded this, what I think is interesting about this is that this could be an example which you would think would follow from something going wrong with anxiety in the metaphysical sense. You're no longer a full subject of experience, and it seems that way to you. Cool. But what's interesting about this is in the paper introducing the E scale, this is not referred to as a disorder of Ipseity. The stuff above is, but this isn't. So they seem to be including something in here which could be a disorder of Ipseity in the metaphysical sense, but they explicitly aren't calling it that, they're calling it something else. All right. So what I've done is I've tried to look at the phenomenology of these symptoms and these experiences which occur in schizophrenia, and have a look at a couple of different literatures which seem to be working with the same notion: pre-reflective self-consciousness, Ipseity. And it seems like people just aren't talking about the same stuff when they do this. There's one very complex set of reasoning which comes through the phenomenological tradition, but then what we're seeing with the natural philosophy approach in the case of Sean Gallagher, and in some of the psychiatric literature at least, is the use of a different notion given the same name. And so I think that as it stands, there just is some confusion about what it is that we're talking about. And ultimately, and I'll wind up here, there's no point going on about this, but that there is different ways in which we can study these things: the metaphysical notion of anxiety, the sort of experiential notion, and the possibility of entailment between those. We have different ways of studying those, and that's the sort of direction that we should be moving, rather than just throwing the label around saying we're doing the same thing when we're not. All right. Okay, thanks to Kristina, who is first author on this paper in virtue of reverse alphabetical, because my name starts with the C, I usually get to go first if we go alphabetical, so we went back the other way. She's at Manberg at the moment, soon to be at Leipzig, and I think when we started working on this in 2011, she was at LSE. So thanks to Kristina, and thanks to you guys.